Alright, so we've got all of our power distribution board with our OSD built onto it, set up and ready to rumble. We've got our power lead set up, heat shrinked on there and everything with the little XT30. So now we're going to go ahead and get started on wiring up the motors. Now the first thing that I always do is mount all 4 of my motors, which actually takes a bit of doing because you need to use Loctite on them. And then I wind up soldering each ESC to the motor, then to the power distribution board individually as I go along in a circle. So the first thing we're going to do is put all of these little motors on here. Now these guys come with these little barrel plug or barrel adapter, banana adapter thingies. You just want to cut those off. The other motors that I've had in the past don't come with these on there. I don't know why they're connected. In theory they're good, but when you're vibrating on your quad in flight and it is coming unconnected, and if you're crashing and they're getting tugged on, all that sort of thing, you just don't need these. So if you have these on your motors, go ahead and pull them off. We're going to go ahead and do that on all 4 of our motors now, and then we'll come back and look at putting them onto the frame. Alright, so we've got all of our motor wires trimmed, and notice that when I took off these little barrel connectors, or banana plugs or whatever you want to call them, that I left an adequate amount of wire on the motors. You don't want to trim anything down too far until you're ready to direct solder it. A mistake that I've made in the past, particularly with my ESCs, and you can see I actually almost made it on this guy, is that you want to make sure that you have enough wire to reach all the way across your boards and go to anywhere that you want. Now with your motors to ESCs, obviously we're working on a very small space here, so we're probably going to need to trim these pretty short, but better safe than sorry. So make sure not to trim anything too short as you're going along. Now the number 1 rule when you're mounting your motors here is to always be sure to use Loctite. Now you may think that you can get away without doing it, and you may very well get away without doing it, but it's only a matter of time until it goes ahead and gives away, and one of your motors is going to fall off, it's going to cut up stuff, it's going to short stuff out. It's just going to be a bad experience. Go ahead and just do this the first time every time. All my frames now have this on here, and I actually use it generally on the screws running through the frame, but on the ones like these are so long that there's not much risk of that completely unscrewing. You're going to catch it before it gets too far. But on your motors, every single time, make sure to use some sort of Loctite, thread lock, whatever. This is just a couple bucks from your local Harbor Freight, so it's not any hassle to use, and it's very cheap and takes about a couple extra minutes to do, and it will save you so much time and money in the long run. Alright, so there's a couple different ways that you can do Loctite. You can either put it in something like a little waterproof little bit of plastic here and then roll it around. I generally kind of do a mix of that and just sort of dabbing it on here and then kind of making sure that it gets down into the threads. So you basically just want to have this on here and have it nice and wet. You don't need to use necessarily too much because you don't want to get it all into the motor and everything, but you want to put a decent amount so that it actually fills up the threads. And then you're going to go ahead and put it through the frame. Put your motor on. You're going to tighten that sucker down. Now it's going to take a couple of minutes to dry, so if you move quickly you actually can get a couple in. You want to do your 2 screws that are catty-corner to each other. That way your motor is kind of guiding itself into the correct position. And so now you're going to get your 2 screws on there catty-corner, and then if you go ahead and tighten these 2 down, it's going to put your motor in pretty much the correct position of where it needs to go. Don't crank them down too far because you'll notice that there's a little bit of a play on your along the axis of those 2 screws. But if you can see the mounting holes for the next 2 motors, you should be in business. And I can pretty well, so I'm going to go ahead and tighten that a little bit more. Now, fun fact about at least the blue thread lock, it tastes really good. I found that out the hard way. It tastes very sweet, and that may actually be something that you can learn from my mistake from, in that your pets or cats or anything may be very attracted to it. So make sure to keep this out of reach of any of your animals, your children, or anything. This stuff is pretty nasty from what I understand. You're not supposed to get it on your hands, and I should probably be wearing gloves, so do that too, but I'm young and invincible, I guess, so we're just gonna full steam ahead here. Now when you're putting these screws in your motors, you want to peek through the cracks as well, and make sure none of these screws that you're putting in are actually making contact with the motor windings. That will cause a short and it'll be really, really bad for you. So on these, I can just barely see the bottoms of the coils through this little gap between the motor bell and the bottom of the motor, and it looks like it should be good to go. Go ahead and power this in just a few minutes and we'll find out for sure, but I think that we are fine with these screws. They don't have much of a bite left to them by the time they go through this bottom plate here. I can't remember the exact measurement on it, but it's not like a 4mm plate or anything like that, so just use the shorter of the screws that your motors come with generally. I've never had to use the longer versions. With a 4mm plate, maybe I did on one of my larger builds, but for this little guy, the short screws work just fine. So you got all 4 in there, they're Loctited in place. Go ahead and crank them down just a little bit. Don't put too much pressure on them because you don't want to strip out the screws or your wrench there. Now a lot of people only use 2 of these bolts here, which is actually pretty much fine in all circumstances, but on these little guys, I mean, these are small motors. They're going to be doing a lot of little vibrations and stuff like that. You don't have much bite going into the motor. I just feel more comfortable putting all 4 on. These things weigh next to nothing, these tiny little screws, so in the end of the day, or at the end of the day, you're only putting on maybe a gram or 2 between all 4 motors of adding them up there. I should probably measure that just to be sure on the scale, but we're just going to go with that, that estimate for now and presume that we're not adding much weight by putting these 4 on here. But 4 screws all Loctite in place. Your motor should not be flying off when you're in flight, and like I said, it sounds really stupid, but it's happened to the best of us. It's happened to me, it's happened to some of my friends, and it's just not a pleasant experience when things go wrong like that. So that being said, the other 3 motors are all done just exactly the same. So we're actually going to go ahead and stop the recording here just for the sake of saving memory and battery, and we'll pick back up when I've got these other 4 motors on with all 4 screws all Loctite in place, and we'll be ready to move on into our ESC mounting. So I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll catch up with you guys in just a second. Alright, so we've got all of our motors on here. As you can see, each of these guys is fully mounted. Got most of the Loctite wiped off. There's a little bit still left in there. That's fine though. It'll dry up and rub right off. So we've got all these mounted. It's looking pretty great so far. These motors look really cool. I'm kind of jealous. These guys are definitely a higher quality than some of the others I've seen. These Rotor X motors, I'm gonna have to throw these on my next build. So the next step is to figure out how we're going to get these ESCs to mount to the arms of the quad and then route our power wires over to the positive and negative rails here. So the problem that this size quad presents is that you have an ESC that is basically the length of the arm here. So with the length of the heat shrink that's on there right now, you can see it's basically impossible to fit that between everything, and then you're blocking your motor and you're not going anywhere. So the first thing we have to do is obviously strip down these ESCs. Remove the heat shrink that comes on here. Sometimes you can actually save a few dollars by ordering what are called naked ESCs. Some of those come without wires generally, I think, but if you've got some laying around, it's really great to you know, save a few bucks where you can and just utilize some extra wire that you've had cut down from some other ESCs if this is not your first build. They also come unshrink wrapped, which, you know, sometimes you have the option to have them shrink wrapped or not. Almost every time I've found that I've wanted them non-wrapped. That is because your motor wires in here actually stay where they're at in here, and you utilize these wires and put them onto the ESC itself. The trick with these smaller guys here is if you have these longer motor wires here than these ones have, you have a lot of extra space, probably about double this, you can actually put your ESC down over the motor wires and then fold them back over and reach these pads here just by without cutting it, because then you don't have to start cutting into this heat shrink here that is attached to the motor wire, and you're getting into like a very dangerous territory of tugging on these wires and whatnot. So if you can do that, I highly recommend it. I found it makes the build a lot more comfortable and gives you more breathing room in your soldering and just in the workflow in general. It makes it fit. It makes everything fit a lot nicer. The only downside is then you have your wires wrapped over. For these guys being so short though, we're gonna have to try to figure something out, because we can either route our ESC signal wire back up this way and then send our power wires back here. But I think what we're gonna actually have to do is trim these guys back as short as we possibly can, get this ESC to fit right in there and solder those motor wires on these pads, and it's going to be a really tight fit, but unfortunately since we don't have that extra length on the motor wires, we're going to have to do it. So the most important thing to keep in mind is not to cut too far into the motors, because while we have an extra sitting on the bench here just in case we mess something up, we don't want to go blowing motors out because we're cutting these cables off and, you know, getting too far down in there. But as you can see, it's really just a short length of heat shrink on here, and you can actually see where it disconnects here. So I think we'll be safe to actually disconnect that, put a smaller piece on there to keep those motor wires in place and kind of hold them together. So we'll put a length of heat shrink on here that's half as long, and we'll trim these motor wires down, and hopefully after doing so we'll be able to fit our ESC there and just do a really tight little solder onto there. Let's go ahead and try that on one of these. So we've got just that slight little bit of heat shrink there. I'm not sure how much it's really going to do, but it's keeping those wires all sort of together and doing sort of the same job that the other guy was doing, just in a lot less, or with a lot less material there. So we have more of the wire length to work with. Go ahead and make sure that that's on there pretty well. The first thing that I always do with my ESCs is, strangely enough, go ahead and just completely take everything off of them on the one side only. You want to leave your signal wire and your positive and negative leads here. And of course on this guy I actually jumped the gun and cut these positive and negative leads, because a lot of times I'll see where I can use material like silicone wire. From the components that I'll be using later in the build, I'll make sure to hang on to that, because once I've cut off this little length of red and black silicone wire, I had lengths of it sitting there that were ready to be used. They're sitting here somewhere. But I was planning on using those for the battery pigtail, just because you can get away with a smaller size on these little guys, especially using an XT30, but we wound up using the thicker stuff, and I think that was the right decision there. If you ever trim anything, do be careful that you don't cut anything too short. That will put you in like a weird spot to where you can't reach where you need to go at a later point. So as you can see, this guy has plenty of room if I mount it right here, and this is the shortest of my ESCs right now. All of the rest of these positive and negatives have way more than enough room. They'll do 3 or 4 laps around this guy before they need to, not actually, but they got plenty of room. So we're just gonna make sure that this guy in particular goes somewhere that, you know, we know that it's going to reach the ground over here, and it's going to reach the power over here, which obviously way more than enough room here on these wires. So we'll go ahead and get this dude mounted up here. We're ready to sort of make this one cut here that we have to make to cut all of these motor wires down. All right, so we've got our ESC all prepped up, the wires removed, and we've got our motor wire, if you can see here, is actually cut down very, very short. Now, we don't have much material to work with here, and I've gone ahead and just barely primed each of those little tips there. So now on your ESCs, and when you're wiring your motors to your ESCs, there's 2 ways of actually reversing 2 of your motors, because as you're flying your quadcopter, 2 of your motors are going clockwise, and then 2 of them are going counterclockwise. The one way to do your motor reversal is to do it hardware side, which, this being a hardware build video, I would prefer to do rather than do it on the BL Heli side of things, because we're not going to go into that, because those software packages are constantly changing a lot quicker than the way that we're wiring things up are changing. So the one way to do it would be to actually take your motor wires here. You have 1, 2, 3 motor wire. You have your motor wires 1, 2, and 3, and on your pads you have 1, 2, and 3 on your ESC. Now, if you wire these up 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, then you wind up with a motor that spins in one direction. Whether that's clockwise or counterclockwise depends on your motor or your ESC. Now, if you wire it up with 2 wires switched, you can switch any 2 wires. Generally, I just switch, whichever 2 are on the outside. You actually wind up reversing your motor. So if you do, instead of 1, 2, 3, you do 2, 1, 3, then your motor will spin the opposite direction. So in my experience, the best way to wire up your 4 ESCs is to do 2 motors with your motor wires wired directly to the 3 pads in the 1, 2, 3 order, and then the other 2 wired reverse. And then if all of them are spinning the wrong direction, you just either switch the 2, you switch all of them from normal to reverse, or you go into BL Heli and switch them all, manually. But that allows you to note which direction that the wires, or which order the wires are soldered onto when you're swapping an ESC in the field. Whereas if you do it on the software side, you need a laptop or something to know which one is reversed and which one's regular. But for the sake of this build, since we're using motors that did not have long enough wires to actually wrap around, I don't want to try twisting these around and whatnot, because these are just kind of little stubs at this point. We're just going to wire all 4 of our motors in the 1, 2, 3 pattern, just directly, wire to pad, and we will go ahead and switch them on the software side of things, which I won't show in this build. But just know that if you were to reverse any 2 wires when soldering into the pads, you will reverse the direction of that motor. And my personal preference is to do that motor reversal on the hardware side of things by soldering, rather than do it in BL Heli. But either way works perfectly fine, and some people may argue for the way that we're going to do it this time. Alright, so let's go ahead and get these ESCs soldered down. We can see that there's plenty of room here now that we've trimmed everything down to go ahead and solder it all down without any fear of it fitting onto the arm. Now something I like to do is use a zip tie here to actually hold the ESC in place while I'm working on it. I've seen people use a Velcro or electrical tape or something like that to hold them down kind of as a permanent thing while they're working on them. And then they'll heat shrink over them and redo the Velcro. So my preferred method is just to use a little zip tie. I buy these by the thousand. They're just really, really cheap. You know, $1,000 for a couple $. Terrible zip ties that I would never use to hold anything that mattered together, but they're really great for these temporary solutions here to just kind of, you know, make something sit still while you're working on it. Obviously using helping hands or something like that would work just fine, but this is just kind of what works for me. So we're getting all 3 of these motor leads, or motor lines here, or the motor wires, whatever you want to call them here. So now all 3 of the motor wires are soldered. We just went ahead and went 1, 2, 3 onto the pads out of the motors. So all of our motors are going to be spinning in the exact same direction, like I mentioned, and we will reverse them when that time comes in the BL Heli suite. So the most important thing to remember to do right now that I forget every gosh darn time I do a build, is to put your heat shrink over your ESC now. Before you actually wire up the power and all that kind of stuff, I always just do it, leave it loose, but then it's on there and you haven't forgotten it. So I'm gonna grab some of that. So this stuff is a little bit big for this frame when you look at it right next to each other, but I'm a big fan of the clear heat shrink just because I've had ESCs where the FETs have blown on me before, and it's nice to be able to see that on the outside and without having to peel back the heat shrink. You can kind of just get a visual indication of what's going on in there if you got the clear heat shrink on there. This stuff really does shrink all the way down to fit around this, even though it does look a little unwieldy right now. It's quite large. Once we get everything wired up, we'll shrink it down and it'll be just fine though. And for that matter, we did just kind of measure that, and then now we're just going to sort of eyeball it. I just kind of made it so that I didn't adjust my fingers on the heat shrink and get everything super skewed, so I don't have heat shrink that winds up being too long or too short or whatever. We'll go ahead and test fit one of these on before I cut all 4 of them actually. So now mind you, it is going to shrink a little bit, but it mostly shrinks in the overall width, not the length. But accounting for that, yeah, we should be good right there. You can see it's going to cover everything up, make sure that nothing's shorting out, and it's not going to get in the way of our motors. So that'll do. We're going to go ahead and we'll take our signal wire here, and we'll just sort of, we're going to go ahead and take our signal wire and just sort of tuck it out of the way. We're going to wrap it around there. Make sure never to power it up with that on there, just in case it does start spinning or something. It shouldn't, but alright, so we're ready to go ahead and wire our power and ground for the ESC over to the power distribution board. And you really want to make sure that you trim all of these wires to the exact length that they need to be. Especially on these tiny little builds, this little Falcon in particular, the way that I build them, you wind up with very little room to breathe here. So you don't want any extra lengths of wire kind of hanging out in the space that you're working with, in the body, the volume of your quad's body. We're basically going to use every spare millimeter of that, every spare square millimeter of that. So make sure you don't cut them too short, but do make sure that they have a little bit of slack and whatnot there, and then you should be good to go there. We're going to solder this guy just to the very edge here. Alright, so you don't need to completely cover it in solder, but you do need to make sure that after a second of it drying, it can be tugged on a little bit, just in case. You don't want to have spare, especially your positive leads, being flinging about and whatnot, even though there's not going to be power flying through that. But you know, you just don't ever want to short anything out. So now make sure that when you solder your ESC cables on, you have a little bit of wiggle room. This is a little bit tight, but again, we're working in a very tight build. So by the time that I get this guy zip tied down here or mounted down to this arm, it's got that little bit of room to wiggle, and if it's going to need to go further than that, you're kind of in a bad situation anyways. But you don't want to do it completely super tight so that, you know, it's totally taut, but you don't want to leave too much room. And then again, on these tiny little builds, you're working with a lot less space than on some of the other ones. So every, you know, cubic millimeter inside of the body of this thing really does matter. So just kind of find a nice balance of where you're comfortable trimming off your wires, and don't try to get too fancy and make it too short. We'll go ahead and tin the wire. This is very important. Make sure that you get solder flowing throughout the core of the wire. all around it so that you have a nice strong joint when you go to set it down. And then, now something else to keep in mind is if you notice that this power lead, it's running straight through the board, so it never actually goes outside of your stack here. You don't want it to come out here. It's not too bad, but you know, the more that you can keep tucked inside of here, the better. So we're actually going to try to fold this guy over, or bend it back just a little bit, just so that the way that the wire routes itself, it sends itself back into the board, and it's not, you know, breaching the outside of the copter here. Again, not the most important thing in the world, but just on a note of trying to build everything nice and clean and keeping everything tidy and packaged neatly. It's just another little attention to detail that I feel really sets things off. The tidier that your wiring looks, the better that it will be in the end. So that guy is on there, settled. I'm giving it a good bit of pressure there and it's not coming off, but again, my ESC still has a little bit of wiggle room. Obviously it's very tight in here in terms of how much room it's got to really move around. So the signal wire is going to go to our flight controller here. So we're just going to tuck this out of the way and we're going to finish up doing all the rest of these ESCs. I'm actually going to hit this guy with the heat gun real quick and then I'll go do the other ESCs off camera. So let's take a look at how well this shrinks up. Alright, so we hit those with the heat gun, and still pretty warm. You want to make sure not to heat up your components too much. This heat shrink does a really good job of getting nice and tight right around the body of the ESC, but it does have a little bit of leftover here on the edges where it doesn't really get tight enough to really clamp down on those motor wires. But for the rest of the ESC, it looks really great. I really do like this clear stuff. I may trim this back at the end of the build when it's all said and done, but for now it's actually clearing the motor and it's out of the way, so I think we're just going to go ahead and leave it and move along. So the ESC signal wires will wire up to the flight controller once we're done finishing up putting all the other ESCs on and we get to that point. Alright, so for right now I'm going to go ahead and wire up the other 4 motored ESC connections and get these guys all trimmed down and get the ESCs wired up and powered up. But before we go ahead and do that, we're going to make sure that this guy is powering on, and we should hear a beep. There we go. So now you're going to hear that beep beep beep, which means that the ESC has received power and it is booting up, and your motor will generally twitch. Sometimes these motors are a little bit, you can kind of feel a click in there. Some of them I've noticed don't actually twitch. I think I've only seen that once or twice, but they should twitch whenever you power them up. So that boot a boop means that the ESC received power. The motor twitch, showing that all of this is powered correctly and it's working correctly. Once we actually wire it up to the flight controller, that boot a boop will have an additional boop boop at the end of it, which means that it's ready to go and it's receiving signal. It's ready to go and that it's receiving signal from the flight controller. But for now, that is exactly the sound that we're looking for. So we're going to go ahead and trim the rest of these motor wires back and wire up all of the other ESCs to the power. Alright, so with that we've got all of our ESCs and motors completely wired up. Now these are all very nice and tidily heat shrunk in this nice clear heat shrink. Again, I may trim this back just a little bit, but it does clear the motors on all 4 of the ESCs. So all of these motors can spin freely without the heat shrink getting in the way, and there's just enough room, and once these standoffs are in here, to push the heat shrink back, or to put a little bit of pressure against the heat shrink and push these ESCs just outside of the way of the frame. So a very, very tight build to do it like this without wrapping your motor wires around the ESC. It actually took me a few minutes longer than I anticipated, just because of the precision of your wire stripping that you have to do on these tiny little motor wires. The little leads, they're just a very unforgiving little bit of wire to work with.